We're proud to announce CISO Stories, a new podcast series in partnership with Cybersecurity Collaborative and Cyber Reason. CISO Stories features the candid perspectives and experiences of frontline senior security executives and dives deep into timely security topics. CISO Stories is hosted by Todd Fitzgerald, VP of Cybersecurity Strategy at Cybersecurity Collaborative, and Sam Curry, Chief Product and Security Officer at Cyber Reason. Listen weekly as they speak with extraordinary CISOs by visiting securityweekly.com/CSP.
And welcome back to Security and Compliance Weekly. Hey, InfoSec World 2021 is proud to announce its keynote lineup for this year's event. Hear from Robert Herjavec. I actually watched that show, Shark Tank or whatever it's called, the other night, so now I know who I'm talking about. Plus, heads of security at the NFL, TikTok, U.S. Department of Homeland Security, Stanford University, and more. Security Weekly listeners can save 20% off the Digital Pass registration. To get that, you go to securityweekly.com/ISW 2021 and register today. Also, coming up on our next live webcast, which is just 2 days from now, October 21st, you can learn why zero-knowledge encryption matters. And then a couple weeks later, on November 4th, you can learn about pragmatic steps to reduce your software supply chain risk. Visit securityweekly.com/webcast to register and save your seat. Also, check out our virtual library of on-demand webcasts and technical trainings at securityweekly.com/on-demand. All right, back to PCI. It's been all of 5 minutes. Chris, can you restate that question you left me with, or at least summarize it, and I will take a stab at my response.
Sure. I was, I was wanting to dig in a little bit about the third parties, right? Okay. A lot of times we relate third parties to the Ciscos and Googles of the world, but kind of focusing in on what has happened not only since GDPR got announced in, what was it, 2016 it got announced, and then all these startups started popping up, but even back to 2013, 2014, when the likes of Kubernetes vendors and the various platforms, if you will, started popping up, all these, we'll call them new startups, right? They're not used to handling PCI. I don't even want to say it's an afterthought. It's not a thought for most startups, right. But they're getting more and more integrated with large vendors, the Costcos, the Walmarts, the Kohl's of the world. So I'm curious how QSAs are going to go about, handling those types of third-party vendors, because they are seeing credit card data, whether they like to admit it or not. By the nature of what they do, they see it.
So it's an interesting question, and you're really touching on, I think, one of the sort of key challenges of PCI, not simply from a large or small merchant perspective, but the trend, as it were, to involve third parties and outsource. There's, if you do a Google search, you can find numerous smaller, startups, as you said, out there that are advertising some sort of little niche solution, mostly that revolves, throw your PCI stuff our way, and we'll make your PCI compliance go away, make it easy, simplify it, ease the burden of it. And there's 1,000 different ways that they're advertising that basically you're outsourcing. And for most merchants, especially smaller ones, the idea, large ones too, the allure of if we don't have to do it, if we're engaging a third party and they're doing it for us, then we're done. This is most of my clientele these days, because the practice that I rejoined a couple years ago, which is the PCI practice I was working with years ago, who have been doing it all this time. That I didn't, they didn't go on sabbatical like I did. They're entrenched. Most of my coworkers are entrenched with their regular customers. Have been working with them for years. I am tending to get more of the one-offs, the new clients, the small peculiar ones, the challenging in the sense that it's not strictly a square peg, square hole type of
I think
assessment
just
process.
Adding some more color.
Sure.
The challenge is, like, if we think about 2018 GDPR came out, 2019 CCPA came out, and these are laws, right? Whereas PCI isn't necessarily a law.
Right.
Part of that is they have to be able to understand whose data they have, where they have it, why they have it, and then ultimately provide it. Well, how do you provide it if you don't capture it somewhere in some system? And that's what these startups are all doing, which inevitably brings them into scope for PCI, but they're just not prepared for it.
Yeah. So, how to make a complicated thing into a simple discussion. You're illuminating a huge problem in the fact that a lot of these third parties that are either, acknowledging that they're taking on the PCI responsibility in order to gain your business, or they're inadvertently picking it up, not knowing it, because you're doing the outsourcing thing. I see that as a huge problem, because I've got customers right now that let's say they have an e-commerce site. That's most, if not all, of their business. The common way to get out of PCI if you're doing e-commerce is to, when it gets around to doing the payment page where the customer's actually typing in the information, that gets either redirected or through an iframe sent over to a third party, and that's all that they do. So you, the merchant, are never seeing the card data. It's not traversing any of your web servers, and of course you don't even have web servers anymore, because that's outsourced as well to a third party. But then you get to do the short form of the self-assessment questionnaire, which is which there's only 20 or 30 questions that you have to answer. And mostly you're validating the claim that you're not seeing card data. It's all being handled by the third party. But the third parties are supposed to be PCI compliant. They're supposed to be acknowledging that they're taking on all of this responsibilities. And as you said, the bigger ones are doing that. It's the little ones that don't realize what they're taking on. I mentioned, I'm sorry, go ahead. Somebody's trying
I was just saying, I was co-signing. I was just saying, yep. That's what I see too, is startups either know that they're in scope. Some of them, all right, they're like, all right, we're third partying it out, but they don't even take a second look on, did you actually implement that correctly? Is it going somewhere else? Do you have some rogue sysadmin that came up with some other solution for a thing, and now you got things over here? Like, they're just not even thinking about it. So I was just agreeing. Sorry.
I'm thinking like the stealth bits, the data discovery vendors, the access control vendors, right? They all have a drastic impact on PCI, but that's not what they're advertising. And a lot of times they don't even understand that they have this impact on PCI. So at some point, either their customers, right, these merchants, or a QSA, or maybe a bank at some point is going to have to make them aware of it. I'm fortunate enough to have been at ISA before, so at least inside of my organization, right, I've made them aware, and we're actually starting to promote and advertise around what we actually help with in PCI. But you have to architect us in such a way we're an assistance and not a problem. But the issue is a lot of these companies don't even know they're impacting it. And so the way they get architected, it actually throws the merchant out of compliance completely.
Well, yes, absolutely. And it's a combination of, they don't know how they're involved, or they don't know that they're involved. And I'd like to think that it's the kind of nuanced one-offs. The rules for service provider are, if you're involved in transmission, processing, or storage of card data, and then they tag on this very subjective or could impact the security of cardholder data. I'd like to think that all of these third parties are hung up on the could impact the security of. Unfortunately, I'm still seeing third parties that are doing the transmission, processing, or storage, but they're like, well, we're not storing the data, so we don't have to do PCI, right? And I'm like, well, no, you are transmitting it, or you are doing something that processes it. That matters too.
My favorite, it's just in memory.
Oh God. Well, that's a client that I have right now that, was trying to go the short route, but then they, because supposedly they're doing all the encryption, except for they're the ones that are doing the decryption and sending it on. It's only in memory. They're not storing it. I'm like, well, guess what? You're just putting all the requirements in scope. They're all applicable to you.
Can we go back to something that's given my compliance brain hives?
Sure.
You're freaking me out with this. We've outsourced the risk comment. Because I think a lot of these organizations forget that they still assume the risk for that. Just because they've gone to a third party doesn't mean that risk isn't, they still have not assumed that risk.
Oh, absolutely. There is no transference of risk in probably 99% of these cases. Although there are some instances that I've seen. A fairly public example I'll use it on air is Square. If you've ever been to like a flea market or more and more small coffee shops and whatnot these days use Square, where it used to be a little thing that you plugged into your phone. Now they have the whole tablet things. Square is a service provider, and they act as a payment processor, and they've got all sorts of little merchants. But they publicly said, we're going to cover the liability for all our merchants. We're not going to make them go out and get PCI compliant. They use our stuff. We'll cover it. That's probably the one stark example. There are others similar to that, but a payment processor or an acquiring bank can absolutely assume the risk and relieve all of their merchant customers, but only they can do that, and that happens on occasion. But far and away, the merchants have been sold by a vendor or a payment gateway, a payment processor, a merchant servicer. There's 1,000 different names for these people that come in and sell their service, sell their devices, and say, if you use this, it's doing encryption, makes PCI go away. And nobody's checking it. Nobody's checking the validity of that statement. Nobody seems to be aware that doesn't alleviate the risk of if you still get a breach, and there's still ways to do that, you still suffer the liability. You can still get fined.
Interesting one is you were touching on a little bit earlier, Jeff, about the e-commerce sites, and maybe they redirect it, maybe it's an iframe, whatever it might be. Just because I've worked with them in the past, right? I'll mention a Certify on here. A Certify it even says so right on their website. They're American Express company, right? American Express is a brand, so it's interesting that the brands are getting involved in this whole tokenization, who arguably becomes a processor at that point, right?
Right.
And that relationship is just odd to me. Always has been, and I think always will be. That the brand could essentially go past the bank and tell the merchant that, hey, we don't need a full rock anymore. We want an SAQ.
Right. So the whole SAQ thing is a known problem. It's been a problem for a long time. And at least the council is aware of it, and they're trying to address it as best they can. We were alluding in the first segment to the whole assessment process, and somebody referred to it as an audit. And the original intent of PCI and the role of the QSA, the Qualified Security Assessor, is they're the security expert. They're coming in and making the interpretation and calling the shots. And as we've said earlier on the air, very often these people don't have that kind of technical security expertise anymore. And frankly, you're not going to get it from, I'll go public with this, you're not going to get it from any kind of training course or certification. That doesn't mean that you've got the chops that you understand what's going on at a technical level. So that's one aspect of it. But a lot of version 4, which I can't go into the details, is actually trying to provide more. I think Kat was asking for more detail of how to, as an assessor, do the right kind of testing, kick the right kind of tires, look under the right hood, that type of thing, to actually give some veracity to your assertion that yes, this client is meeting this requirement. So that's coming. But getting back to, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. So I was just going to say, so then where does the liability lie? So if they actually comply with what those instructions are to say, if you do this, then there's a level of compliance, and there's still some type of an incident, then I feel like if they get too tight on that, then now it's going to come back to whose responsibility is this? And we did everything that you said, and there was still an issue.
Well, and a merchant gets breached, and they're looking at the fines, and of course the headline is always, they were PCI compliant at the time of the breach, or they weren't.
Right.
But they, as a merchant, go to our QSA company said we were compliant, so they countersue them. It has happened.
Yeah, this is everybody's hands pointing in different directions.
There's still that common point of purchase, man. So it's like.
Well, and it's only going to get worse now that the QSA not only is interpreting whether you meet the requirement or not, but whether what you're doing alternatively to meet the requirement is acceptable, A, and B, are you doing it correctly to meet the requirement? Stay tuned on that.
The breach thing, I'll tell you, Jeff, is interesting. Again, as these other laws have come in, PCI is of course a factor. And you lose 1 million credit cards, right? Your bank's probably going to flip a lid. The processor's going to flip. But then you have the attorney generals and you've got the DPAs from GDPR poking their nose in and say, well, you had this legal requirement. Forget this regulation that you wanted to follow or this guideline, right? You had this legal requirement that you failed on. We want 4% of your business or whatever it is, right? So I think at that point, the in-house counsel, even they are kind of forgetting about, what their, month over month expenses could be in light of a PCI breach, right? Because their bank is ultimately going to, you're going to incur, transaction charges and all that stuff, right? Your rate's not going to stay what it was before the breach. But the in-house counsel is all focused on this massive fine from these DPAs and all that, not so much on the PCI stuff.
Kat, you have a question you're dying to ask.
I know, I totally am dying to ask it. I'm curious what the actual. I want to talk about what is the actual maybe theoretical T here that's going to be in the PCI DSS 4.0. Like, what are those significant changes going to be? Because I know that the two of you are plugged in, right? Like, or I'm assuming you are anyway. Y'all have to have the T. Maybe we can even figure out what it is by what special interest groups popped up in the last couple of years to where it might make it into 4.0.
Well, I can speak for myself. I'm plugged in because we're a QSA company. We have access to the drafts, and we've been participating in the feedback loop, which has been an extended period. But we're also under NDA, not to reveal details. So that's why I have to tread a little bit, lightly. I would say that the big change that's coming is, as we've talked about, the idea that there's more flexibility perhaps in what constitutes meeting a requirement by doing away with the compensating controls. I'd say there's also going to be well, let me back up and say it's going to look a lot the same. They fundamentally don't change a lot, and I sort of agree with it, because at a theoretical level, security, the basics, the fundamentals of security do not change. It's how you do them, given the new technology, the new environments, and so on and so forth. So they are trying to, as best as they can, do away with some of the old archaic requirements that just really don't apply anymore. And try to focus more and sort of fine tune and define what they already had there, but more explicitly state, this means this. You don't have to infer or guess, especially when it comes to the whole idea of cloud and containers and serverless. I mean, there's pitched arguments on whether you need to follow the firewall requirements anymore, given that you don't technically have a firewall in the cloud.
But there is a similar concept going on into clouds. You know what I mean? But they want to swap out firewall for something a little more present day. That would be cool.
But that's been part of. Well, go ahead, Chris. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say. So I'm I'll say I'm one layer disconnected from Jeff, right? I was an ISA. That's of course expired. I was never a QSA, so I'm not in that same circle that Jeff is, but having the connections I have, right, I'm very much plugged in with people who are QSAs as well as Big Fours who, are in the inner circle just because by nature of who they are. What I've heard a lot of talks about, it goes back to because of the systems of the PASs and all this stuff, right? Kubernetes has gotten huge. Docker has taken off. All these containerized systems, serverless environments. There's organizations out there that live wholeheartedly off these things now. They don't have your traditional, e-commerce DB2 system or SQL system or whatever it may have been. Now it's this NoSQL Mongo thing. Maybe it's Cassandra, right? It could be S3 with Hive layered over top of it, right? The possibilities are endless. But what has come up is because of technology that was developed in light of GDPR, like 2016, 2018, these discovery mechanisms, if they can find everything about a person, then they can certainly find a credit card. Right? There's LEN checks, there's mod 10s, there's all kinds of ways of validating that you either do or don't have a credit card present in that system. So this idea of providing assurance and validation that what the merchant is telling the QSA is their CDE, what is actually in scope versus what's out of scope, well, now you can prove it, right? You run one scan of that software that these companies arguably by law have to have. You run one scan and now your QSA is almost certain they're looking at the right segment. And so that's kind of where the Big Four are leaning, right? They're expecting to see these validation mechanisms in place.
Yeah, I keep debating whether this is like a big, huge reveal or not. I don't think it is. And if I end up being fired from my day job,
on the right nail. See, I don't even have the inner circle, and I know.
Right. Well, getting back to the whole notion of, the scrutiny on the third parties and the role of the service provider, which is a lot of what the present is when it comes to PCI, for a lot of right reasons, not just the dodging the, having to do PCI belief. But, necessarily for a lot of small companies, they're never going to afford the infrastructure and everything that goes into satisfying all these security requirements. So it makes sense to outsource. And all of this newfangled terminology, it's outsourcing at some level.
Yeah.
So I'll back it up for you, Jeff, so that you can answer it freely. We'll relate it to 3, 2, 1. Right. In your QSA, life, you go into a customer and you say, all right, we've got these 300 umpteen controls, right? The full rock. We're going to do all of this. And then you start the discussion about scope, right? Well, we don't feel that we're in scope for half of those controls. So here's why. And they start explaining to you, right? And then they show you this drawing and say, well, this is my CDE, right? Well, as you as a QSA, how are you assured that that's their CDE, other than this drawing that they put in front of you that anybody could have, put together? I mean, they could have got it from a different company. You don't know, right? So how do you go about building that credibility with your client that what they're telling you is true?
Well, I do it by asking a series of questions, and it's ultimately show me. Show me the systems, show me the configurations, show me the data flows. Some QSAs will actually, want PCAPs. I don't usually go that route personally, although, my company does. We'll do some sort of, network sniffing to ultimately prove. But to me, that's always been the beauty of PCI is 60% of it is show me the documentation, whether it's a policy standard or procedure or configuration or whatever. And then let's go see how you're doing what you claim to be doing by, shoulder surfing, looking at actual configuration settings and things like that.
I think the question becomes, right, Bob the Builder out there 8 months ago, he took a backup of the commerce database and it's sitting in this access database now, right? And it's not in the same VLAN or the same network segment as the CDE is, but you've got 2.5 million credit cards sitting over there, right? So
yeah, I mean, you're highlighting what to me is a huge concern. Is more and more companies are, doing the short forms of the self-assessment questionnaire, which sometimes are just sort of a template because they still have to do a ROC, but the applicable requirements are based on these shorter form SAQs, and the SAQs are based on the particular payment acceptance method, which will naturally preclude some of the requirements from being applicable. It's a long-winded way of saying that they reduce their scope.
So if you
my
had
big concern.
if you had a product out there, right, that they could show you, hey, we know this is our scope because we've scanned our environment. Here's the list of servers we've scanned. Here's the list of networks we've scanned. We've scanned all of it looking for these 16-digit numbers, what have you. And this is where they come back at, exactly where we thought they were at, right? So if you just had that report, right, wouldn't that instantaneously build your confidence with your customer?
Well,
nothing builds my confidence. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No worries. I was just going to go into my methodology when I was a QSA. So far as scope and stuff like that, I haven't been one in a while, but I used to be. And it's exactly how Jeff says. It starts with some questions and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of my customers wouldn't even know the creative and inventive ways that they were taking credit cards. So it's not like they were lying. They just didn't know that was a creative way for them to be taking credit cards. So for example, oh, do you have a call center? Okay. Oh, it's VoIP. Things like that, right? Or, okay, you got a knuckle buster, like when you guys are out on the road. Okay, what do you do for that, right? So that was the first thing. It's not always like, it's not just the tech, it's also people, places, that sort of thing, right?
Yeah.
So questioning around that. And a tool is not going to scan for that stuff. You do have to ask questions. You got to have a little bit of that human side.
Sure.
But on the same token, yeah, we would actually, there would be an element especially with technology of, okay, go ahead, prove it. And if you're looking at, say, current architecture, we're just going to go into like AWS type of stuff. You can kind of easily see, if you have a little technical knowledge, that what they're claiming is either true or not true. But what I don't know, I'm not too familiar with the scanning products you're talking about. But if it's looking for a 16-digit, it would number, it would theoretically be looking for that in plain text, right? Just because it's encrypted somewhere, it's still in scope. And so that scanning tool, wouldn't that theoretically miss it if it's encrypted and doing the right things over here,
It depends on the system. Certain products have the ability to decrypt the data, scan it, and then re-encrypt it. So they will see that it is a credit card.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. All right.
No issues with that methodology.
Yeah, I was just thinking that.
Wow.
Yeah, no.
It's not increasing my comfort level at all.
There's also double
for the record, Joe,
right?
Just a quick question. Joe, have you ever been a QSA? Have you ever done PCI?
No.
And that's why you're laughing at us on the inside. Okay. No, fair enough. So to try to round out the answer to your earlier question, because I have to give so much preamble to it, the big change with 4.0 is really trying to address the third-party thing and really trying, I think, to clarify the fact that Visa did away with level 1 and level 2 a while ago. And the implication is simply level 1 in the old days, service providers had to go through a full-blown assessment and have a ROC done by a QSA, whereas if you're a level 2, you're a little guy, so you get to do a self-assessment questionnaire. They are eliminating the self-assessment questionnaires for service providers with the advent of 4.0. And that's what I was like, I don't think that's a deep, dark secret. But I think it addresses the fact that there's so much confusion from the card brands of what the notion of level 1 and level 2 is, and whether a third party should be going through a full-blown assessment, which my take is the card brands kind of have the expectation that if you're a third party, if you're supporting other companies, other organizations, other merchants, credit card processing programs, they really want you to go through a full-blown assessment. And I think that's one of what's going to be the biggest impacts of version 4.0 is that coming from the council and clarifying it. There's going to be no way for a little guy service provider to do a self-assessment question anymore. They have to do the ROC because there is no self-assessment questionnaire for them to fill out. Kat, you had a comment?
No, I was just going to say, good. That's how it should be. You're literally affecting other people's PCI and security footprint and stuff like that. Good.
Yep. The other comment I wanted to make, which is a little bit nuanced, is there is a difference, and I try to explain this to my merchant customers, and I don't know if I succeed or not. There's a difference between a third party is, taking on the responsibility for certain requirements. Therefore, you as the merchant get to check the box, not applicable. We don't do this. We don't do this. There's a difference between the requirement just doesn't apply to your environment versus there's a third party doing it for us. That means it's still applicable. That means you're checking the box as compliant, and you're validating that by looking at the third party, seeing if they have their own attestation of compliance, looking at the responsibilities matrix and seeing that, yes, they are actually saying they're meeting this requirement. But most of the merchant customers I deal with, they're just, deer eyes in the headlights, thinking, oh, we've done away with so much scope. We can do the short form. Everything's not applicable because we don't do it. No, that's not exactly right. The clarification, I think, is one of the big pending, hopefully impactful changes coming in version 4 is clarification on all this third-party stuff.
And it's interesting too, like that sharing of third parties, the credit card data and whatnot. Under these GDPR, CCPA, again, just to hit on that a little bit, they actually pair up with PCI quite nicely in that regard. Because part of the process, you as a consumer have the right to request that the merchant, the vendor, provide you with where they got the data from and who they're sharing the data with and why. So any of it's financial data, if any of it's transactional, maybe it's marketing, whatever it might be. But if your finance data goes out there, arguably, right, as we're saying, they should be compliant, not just with the privacy regulation, but with PCI as well.
So, all of this great discussion, and version 4 is supposed to be coming out early next year, but it's not going to be enforced or in full force until 2024 or 2025. Chris, any thoughts, or Kat or Joe, any thoughts on why an organization should be an early adopter? Because that's always an option, even though the new standards out there, you're always allowed to use the old one up to a certain date. What are some reasons why a company should opt for just sort of jumping to the new and dive off the cliff feet first? Anyone?
I'll go.
Go.
So, being an early adopter, of course, the QSAs are going to cut you a little bit of slack, right? You're going to run into things they themselves haven't seen yet because they haven't done very many assessments, based on the new standard. You're going to be kind of the pioneer. The saving grace is during this phase of where 3.2.1 and 4.0 are both acceptable, right? An argument could be made to a QSA that, yeah, we don't meet the new control in 4.0, but we do meet it in 3.2.1. So can you cut us some slack, or can you write it in the ROC in such a way that the bank will accept it? Right. So right now, while both standards are active, you could make that argument. If you wait until 2024, 2025 to take your first stab at it, there's a good chance you may not make your date. Not saying you won't get compliant, right? But you may have to have extensions, and QSA might be there longer than you think.
Joe, Kat, any thoughts? Joe, theoretically, maybe?
I mean, theoretically, when I think, oh, sorry, go, Kat.
No, go ahead, Joe.
I was going to say, when I think of it from the compliance standpoint, it just, anytime you give anyone more latitude, they're going to take it. So, I feel like if that, as long as that runway is, most organizations are going to push it to the absolute limit and then claim that there was good intent to comply, but just the inability to get everything done. I mean, that's what we see with almost every security related regulation.
Live in that gray zone.
Yeah, we love the gray.
Yeah.
I would say as an internal, if I'm playing I'm an internal security person and I'm convincing people to just go ahead and do this, like my leadership and things like that, I'm gonna say, all right, sell it to your customers as we're on 4.0, even if they don't know what the hell that means, right? For us to kind of improve our security, it is always better to go ahead and be doing the most latest and greatest advice and best practice. No, so that's kind of how those are the benefits, I guess, of doing 4.0 as soon as it comes out, or as soon as you can. Really, it really depends though on what the actual I'm gonna say a compliancy thing, which is it depends. It depends on what those new things are going to be. But if you are this B2B service provider that you were doing, you were a level 2 or whatever, SAQing it up, maybe it's time to pay to play and grow up a little bit. Because we do see out here in the Bay, we do see a lot of startups where their concern is not security, it's the MVP. It's getting into the market quickly. So I do kind of like that, the change that you mentioned. I hope that it evolves and matures a lot of players that are out here that are going to be tomorrow's major players. I think it's a good thing.
Yeah, I guess, my experience has been, from past rollovers to newer versions, 1 to 2, not so much 2 to 3, because technically I stepped out of the QSA role about the time version 3 came out, but I certainly still had my finger on the pulse. The idea of early adoption, very much a marketing slogan, Kat. How do you set yourselves apart from the competition? We're already on version 4 PCI. That probably has mixed messaging because so many people are clueless about what PCI is about anyway. When we were doing especially 1 to 2, that's what I can speak to most definitively. The advantage was the clarifications that were coming in, and there'll be clarifications with version 4. I think more so in version 4, there's going to be, these requirements make so much more sense now in the context of the new technology we've deployed, in the context of we're outsourcing to one of many cloud vendors and so on and so forth. It'll just it's probably will make more sense to go version 4 early than to keep trying to jerry-rig version 3.2.1 and interpret the language that was really written with another technology and another way we do networking in mind. Which is not to say that there's a complete rollover, but there's certainly a context that's shifting to try to orient the way PCI is interpreted in a modern network infrastructure type of topography. That's where I would lean. There's always going to be companies that hold out to the bitter end, much like the deadline for updating your end of life equipment was 6 months ago. Is it time to start the 18-month project to refurbish all your cash registers type of thing? That's never happened.
One thing's just hitting me too, Jeff. I'm curious. Recent technology, right? The whole retina, fingerprint, double tap, right? All this stuff with your phone for payment methods now. It's going to be interesting to see how this gets incorporated in 4.0.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see how it gets incorporated from the perspective of all these providers are, in theory, PCI compliant and are doing the right things with your data. Because most of what these things are offering is you're not exchanging the actual credit card. It's essentially on file somewhere. And presumably it's on file in a secure, encrypted fashion. And what they're passing around is tokens or a lookup to the whatever database or vault is held.
It'd be interesting to see Apple and Google's rocks at some point.
Yeah, it would be. And then part of me doesn't want to see it because I fear the lack of interpretation or misinterpretation that so many of them. I mean, I spend most of my days these days as a QSA explaining to my clients what the requirements really mean and why they should still care about it, even though they think they've de-scoped. It's still basic fundamental security stuff that you should be doing just about anywhere in your organization to protect any kind of data you care about. That's what I keep falling back on. We are getting on to the time where we need to wrap up. Chris, any final thoughts, gems of wisdom, or just bombs you want to drop on us and leave us hanging with?
I did have one big question for you.
Okay.
And see what your guys' take is on it. So again, beating on the privacy drum a little bit here, with 4.0 being revamped, updated, refreshed, whatever terminology you want to use, do you feel like the council or those associated with the council, right, the SMEs, do you feel like they're going to have enough representation to go to the level of the Senate or the Congress, or whether it's at the state level or the federal level, to get in on these laws to say, hey, look, in the PCI, we do X, Y, and Z, but in your privacy data, which is PCI and everything else, right? It's HIPAA, it's all of it. In those standards, you're saying they only have to do this. So why are you not meeting our baseline? So do you feel like PCI is going to kind of start setting the standard for what the terminology they like to use in privacy is acceptable controls or acceptable security measures? Do you think that will become PCI? What's your feeling on that?
Joe, Kat, have any thoughts before I weigh in? Going once, going twice.
No, sorry, I was on the Discord talking to people there, so I was tuning out. Sorry, my bad. It's hard.
That's important too. It is. It's. We try to make more squirrels than anybody can handle. So I'll take the question, and actually, it's a really good segue to wrapping up, and I'll tell you why, Chris. So the question of, do you think PCI will sort of lead the charge on sort of normalizing some of these requirements, especially as they converge between security and privacy? I would like to say yes, but I would like to think that the fact that PCI, that's been around since 2004, would have had more of a direct impact. And to me, the question is more, why hasn't it had more of an overarching impact, especially on regulatory compliance, whether it's security or privacy? To that end, I will say, tune in next week, because we're actually going to be talking to people that might actually be able to answer that question in an authoritative manner. So, Chris, thank you for joining us today and facilitating this very fascinating, if not depressing discussion of PCI. Depends on your perspective. Next week, we're being joined by Tony Sager, who's Senior VP and Chief Evangelist for the Center for Internet Security, that's CIS, as well as and this is kind of cool, his son, Thomas Sager, who's also works for CIS as an associate cybersecurity engineer. They were originally planning on doing a talk at InfoSec World, and they had to cancel for some reason, but we're going to take up the the topic of what they were going to talk about, which is this whole notion of how organizations have to meet so many regulatory compliance standards and frameworks that they end up, needing to and attempt to cross map all the security frameworks. So I think that'll be a perfect context to ask the question you just asked, Chris, is as far as the impact and from a personal perspective. I've always wanted to ask people from CIS, why don't you just, why dream up something new all the time? Why not just start with PCI? Because it's been around for so long. And I would ask the same question of NIST folks as well, and whoever else puts out regulatory frameworks. So I'm not answering your question. I'm going to make sure it gets asked next week. So that's going to wrap us for today. Again, Chris, thanks for joining. Joe, welcome to the team. I hope we didn't scare you off. Thanks, Kat, for your contributions as well. Thanks for everybody that joined in on Discord. We will do it again next week with the father and son team, the Sagers from CIS. We'll see you then.